So this is the French Revolution and the rule of Napoleon between 1774 and 1815, starting with French, the features of the Ancien regime in France. So, let's talk about these features. The inheritance of Louis XVI. He had previous monarchs had kept noble plots to conspire under control. He was left with the most powerful army in Europe, the Grand Army of France. The Palace of Versailles was created 2 kings prior to him as a symbol of the monarchy. However, his father left lots of debt in livres from wars to extend French powers, and so Louis XVI was left with a lot of debt and a slightly hostile parliament. In terms of the king, to pass laws, he needed them to be ratified by one of the 13 regional parliaments. But to be fair, that's not too hard because you just get the Vermont people or whatever to agree with you, the loyalists. He was fluent in English and Italian, which is good, but still not as many languages as other people at the time. He was married to Marie Antoinette of Austria in 1770. However, no male heir was produced until 1781. Louis met with each department individually to discuss policy change, which meant that the court factions found themselves working against each other rather than working in unison. Now let's talk about the estates. Firstly, we have the First Estate, which it was the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church, who made up 0.5% of the population. 6% of land was owned by them, however, and they controlled all education and hospitals. They raised tithes on their lands. Church courts handled moral matters, and the clergy was made exempt from direct taxation. The Second Estate had 140,000 nobles. They owned between 1/4 and 1/3 of the country's land. The pinnacle of this was the nobles d'épée, which were nobles of the sword, who were hereditary nobles, who received royal patronage, and they dominated office holding in parliament and stuff, and saw it as property rather than an opportunity to make advancements in French society. In the Third Estate, there were town-dwelling bourgeoisie who became wealthy but still only received the same rights as the peasants. And there were also people like the sharecroppers who were very poor and lived on rented farmland to survive. Alright, let's talk about what people were put in place to solve the issue of the deficit, which was a major issue. Firstly, we have Turgot, who was an intellectual and administrator who had been intendant of Limoges. His good reputation led Louis XVI to appoint him as Controller General of Finances in 1774. His policy was to increase wealth by freeing trade and reducing waste. His 6 edicts proposed far-reaching reforms, including ending restrictions on corn trade, abolishing trade guilds, and ending the corvée, which was unpaid labour. But he had enemies at court, and public unrest grew around ending controls on corn prices. Most of his reforms were not implemented, but he did introduce a fleet of fast carriages for the post. He was dismissed 2 years later in 1776. Then we have Necker, who was a swift lawyer who became an influential banker with a large fortune. He worked in the French East India Company and was responsible for loans to the French monarchy. In 1777, he was made Director General of Finances. This was because he was Protestant and he couldn't be called the Controller General due to this. He opposed Turgot's free trade, and saw the key to public finance as establishing confidence in among lenders, and so he arranged for the royal accounts to be published in 1781. Still, he resigned in 1781, but returned to office in 1788. He made the arrangements for the Estates General, only to be dismissed in 1789, but was recalled once again due to public pressure. He resigned again in 1790 and died in Switzerland. Then we have Cologne, who was in between Necker. Necker's kind of reigns. He was an aristocratic lawyer, a royal official, and a former intendant who became Controller General in 1783 with the support of the leading minister of Vergennes. He took some of Turgot's ideas, but his main strategy was a reformed land tax that didn't get approved by the Special Assembly of Notables in 1787. He was dismissed and went into exile in London, and then Necker came back in. The issues that Turgot first found when he stepped into solving the deficit and the boots of the Controller General of Finances in 1774 was that there was no system of accounts for the finances of officials and their departments. Balance sheets were years out of date. The Crown defaulted on its debtors to save money. There had been little attempts to economise, and an example of this is Louis saying, "It will be someone else's problem when I die." And the annual deficit was 37 million livres, and the total was 235 million livres. So very poor. Now let's talk about reasons for French unrest, and then some of the political developments. Start with the Enlightenment. So we'll do the saloons first. There were over 80 saloons by 1785, which was up from 3 from 1700. There was a classical revival going on, so in the 1770s and 80s there were toga parties, and interests in the virtues of Greek and Roman societies grew massively at the time. Reason and science was a massive part of the Enlightenment. People became less superstitious, and Denis Diderot's encyclopedia, published on the years 1750 and then once again in 1752, helped people, establish a strong grounding in fact and reason. In terms of politics, John Locke wrote on the ideas of natural rights and anti-despotism. Despotism, yeah. And Rousseau was talking about purity and honesty needing to be reclaimed in society. In terms of religion, abstinentism and pluralism were rife in the Catholic Church at the time. The religion was seen as standing in the way of progress. And the cures, which were parish priests, complained that archbishops were taking the vast sum of the tithes. In terms of the urban areas, after Turgot's reforms, it was easier to become an employing master in the urban areas. There were 40,000 by 1780. Despite this, it was made stricter to employ, and records had to be kept in masters' liveries, and those without these papers had their shops and homes raided. In Paris alone, there were 25,000 prostitutes. The urban areas were overcrowded, and there were rises in food prices, which was devastating. From 1787, there were frequent food riots, unemployment loomed, and unemployment reached 80,000 in Paris this year. This unemployment loomed in the Faubourgs, which were the ghettos, which were made part of the inner city due to the implementation of new tax collection posts. So they had more direct taxation as being made part of the inner city, even though geographically they weren't moved anywhere. And now let's talk about the rural issues. In the winter of 1788 and 89, it was a bit of a shambles. There wasn't enough food to go around, really. There was more pressure on peasants following 1760, as landowners tried to claim more common land, and rural areas all had tough tax, with the taille being the land tax, the gabelle being the salt tax, and the tithe being the church tax. Let's talk about the political developments then. Firstly, we have the 1787 Assembly of Notables. So, the Assembly of Notables was summoned on the advice of Cologne, with 3 propositions to end the corvée and reform the complex customs, the new uniform land tax, ending the privileges, and third and finally, creating elected local assemblies to assess and administer tax. And that was on the advice of Cologne. Cologne knew that Parliament would appease these changes, or at least he predicted they would, and the 7 princes of the blood resided over the 7 committees that were held during the Assembly of Notables. Yet the new calls for taxation resulted in calls for representation, as was seen in the American Revolution. This was because it ended in a stalemate. Now, talking about the American Revolution, the Americans had a constitution around the same lines as suggested by Montesquieu. They had religious equality and toleration. They had the right to rebel against tyranny, and 1.3 million livres was added to the national debt as a result of the revolution. And the French fighters were coming home following liberating the country without their country being liberated. And they had achieved much less tax, which is another thing that the French desired. And they had established their natural rights, put in place by Locke, suggested by Locke even. And after the Assembly of Notables, we have the calling of the Estates General. It was called by Cologne's successor, de Brienne, who was only in it for a short period of time. This calling of the Estates General was seen as a surrender rather than a push for policy change. It proposed a revision of Cologne's suggestions with a new uniform land tax. And yet these reforms were stated by the Notables as needing approval from the Parliaments and the Estates General. So the Day of Tiles began following the exile of Parliament from Grenoble. And then the Estates General was forced to be called. Following this, we have the Cahiers. So Louis, the king, wished to see the kind of grievances and wishes of his people, and it had followed Necker's reinstation as the director of finances, and this backfired as it encouraged an expectation for change which never came. Then the fourth political development that we have is the meeting of the Estates General in between May and June in 1789, in which 604 new deputies were created for the Third Estate, and the tennis court oath took place. Okay. Then we have the events following the National Assembly on the 17th of June, 1789, and the tennis court oath. Alright. So, following this tennis court oath, a heap of things happened. The first being the revolt in Paris and the storming of the Bastille, which took place on the 14th of July. As a preface to this, before this happened, Louis took action to try and restore order in the last week of June following the calling of the Estates General, and he moved troops into Paris and Versailles. On the 11th of July, 20,000 troops in the area gave Louis the ability and willingness to dismiss Necker, the popular financier, which sparked discontent. The National Assembly was renamed the National Constituent Assembly because it was now a constitutional monarchy. Yep. The news of Necker's dismissal spread on the 12th of July, and high food prices had already led to rioting, so the tensions were obviously bustling. Radical orators like Desmoulins claimed a massacre of reform supporters was planned, so he spread tension. And the Paris electors created a citizens' militia to establish some peace and unity. The next day, on the 13th, barricades had stopped more troops from entering Paris, and in Versailles the Constituent Assembly called for the removal of all troops from Paris and Versailles. On the 14th of July, the first journée took place in the Revolution, which was the storming of the Bastille, in which Parisians seized arms from the Les Invalides kind of arms holding for the army, and then they stormed the castle, and then 93 people in total on both sides were killed, and the people and the Garde Francaise were involved in the storming of the Bastille. Norway was surrendered and murdered on the spot, who was the kind of captain of the castle of Bastille at the time, and Louis lost control of the armed forces in Paris. And the next day, on the 15th, Louis visited the National Constituent Assembly to announce his withdrawing of troops from Paris and Versailles, so he kind of gave in. The Paris electors created the new revolutionary council called the Commune, and the citizens' militia became the National Guard, commanded by Lafayette, which is because they wanted to keep the sans-culottes under control from being too overly revolutionary. 2 days later, on the 17th of July, Louis was forced to share power with the National Assembly, and he recalled Necker and visited Paris, where he recognised the legality of the Commune and the National Guard, and many nobles left the country in the following weeks. So despite the fact that they became the Constituent Assembly like a couple of weeks earlier, just over 2 weeks earlier, only on the 17th of July did the people called the Constituent Assembly become part of a constitutional monarchy. Sorry, the way I said it before made it sound like constituent and constitutional had anything to do with each other. In this case they do, but they're not like linguistically linked. Right then, the Great Fear took place after that. These are developments in the country. the revolutionary committees were set up all across France. The royal authority collapsed, and the king's intendants abandoned their posts. There were high food prices and layoffs of the poorest, which increased further discontent. There were rumours that brigands had been hired by fleeing nobles to destroy crops, and tithe and church barns even, were attacked and raided for the stock holdings of food. Then we have the abolition of feudalism within the Great Fear. It was done to crush the rural revolt by the National Constituent Assembly in this case, in the August decrees. The feudal rights over people were abolished. Tithes, hunting rights, and seminal courts were abolished. All citizens were to be taxed equally, and all citizens eligible for any office in the church, state or army were allowed to achieve these posts. In 1793, nobles received compensation for the removal of the privileges that feudalism gave them. Then we have the declarations. The Declaration, this is still within the Great Fear, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which was on the 26th of August 1789, which brought an end to the Ancien Regime and saw a law of equal rights established. Then we have the infamous October Days. So the first thing that happened in the October Days was the suspensive veto, which was on the 11th of September, and Louis was made allowed to suspend the passing of a law for 4 years. So he still had some control in this constitutional monarchy. Unrest in Paris started growing, and the flight of aristocrats had hit trade badly. There was lots of unemployment. Bread and other foods were in short supply following a lack of peasant work. Jean-Paul Marat stirred up the scene kind of with his newspapers and that, and his fighting words. The National Guard struggled to maintain order, and as a product of this, rioting spread, and the king was urged to flee. Despite this, he remained in Paris. Then another key thing that happened in the October Days was the king insulting the revolution. On the 2nd of October, the king insulted the tricolour at a banquet for the Flanders Regiment, which was the most loyal regiment that the king had in the Royal Guard. And this knowledge was further used against him to prove his disdain for his citizens. And following this, kind of as a side story, Marie Antoinette became further hated by the public, following, let me cake rumours spread by people in the same vein as Jean-Paul Marat and all the diamond and jewellery controversies. Then the March to Versailles took place in the October Days, which was the second journey. On the 5th of October, women in Paris, mostly tradeswomen, seized weapons and marched to Versailles. The National Guard did nothing to stop them, potentially because they were on their side. And Louis was forced to agree with the August decrees that they had proposed. So, what was the result of the October Days? Both the National Constituent Assembly and the royal family were now essentially prisoners in the centre of Paris, where they were now vulnerable to the power of the crowds. And that is kind of the first main topic, which is the causes of the French Revolution from 1774 and the events of 1789. Alright, and now we're moving on to Revolution from October 1789 to the Directory 1795. So, reforms in the Church and the State, 1789 to 91. Alright, let's talk about the Church. Actually, no, political first. Political and administrative reforms. France was divided into 83 departments for elections and local governments. These were divided into districts, cantons, and communes, which would be run by elected councils. Active citizens, which is men over 25 who paid enough tax, were allowed to vote in these local council elections, which is 4 million men in total. In terms of tax reforms, everyone now pays the same tax, and all were liable to pay the land tax and tax on commercial profits. Active citizens also paid a tax on movable goods such as grain. Judicial reforms. All previous courts were replaced by a more uniform system. There was a justice of the peace in each canton. Trial was by jury, and torture and mutilation were abolished. Justice was free and equal for all. Let's talk about the church reforms. Bishops' dioceses were reorganised to fit the 83 departments. Appointment to any clerical post was through election. All clergy were forced to take an oath to the Constitution, which was the 1790 clerical oath. Yet 50% of them refused and became what's known as refractory priests, which angered devout Catholics, which consisted of devout Catholics who were devout to the Pope and the King. All church property became property of the state. Pluralism and abstentism was abolished. There was no more tithe, and clergy were paid by the state, and Protestants were given full civil rights. In terms of economic and social change, all internal customs barriers were abolished. Under Locle-Chapelier on the 17th of, in 1791 of June, the guilds that regulated craft industries and trade unions were banned, and strikes were made illegal, which benefited the rich rather than the poor. The deputies saw relief of the poor as the duty of the state, but regardless, little was done to enforce this view. At this time, 2 million people were beggars, and the assignats were introduced to finance government, backed by the sale of church land, which made the clergy dependent on the state and helped the economic situation. Let's talk about the end of privilege. On June 1790, a law ended hereditary nobility, and Parliament was abolished 1790 as well. Now let's talk about the attempts to establish a constitutional monarchy. The King and the flight to Varennes. The King was accepting of the revolution until he realised his weak position as a prisoner in Paris and the changes to the church. When the royals had previously tried to leave to go to St. Cloud, crowds had blocked them. He tried to leave disguised with his family on the 20th of June 1791, but he was caught, and the Parisian crowds watched in silence as he was kind of escorted back. This resulted in many no longer trusting in the monarchy, the rise of republicanism, and the constitutional monarchy being placed in doubt. In terms of political clubs, the Cordeliers and later the Jacobins were the radical clubs, whereas the Feuillants were more moderate, and the Club Monarchique were the monarchists. The demonstration at the Champs de Mars in 1791 was when the Cordeliers organised a signing ceremony for a Republican petition Champs de Mars, in which 50,000 people attended, and the National Guard under Lafayette showed up and fired, killing 50 people. The leaders of the Cordeliers, Brissot and Panton, fled following this massacre at Champs de Mars. Talking about the Legislative Assembly, in 1791, the 1791 Constitution replaced the National Constituency Assembly with the Legislative Assembly, and 745 new deputies met for the first time on the 1st of October 1791. And the vast majority were rich, as this is what the electoral system favoured at the time. A few were notables that had emigrated or retired to their country estates, whereas a few were deputies of the clergy, but most were kind of revolutionary thinkers in that. So, let's talk about the Jacobins and the significance of riots and direct action. The eastern Faubourgs, kind of ghetto districts, Paris, were crowded and prone to food riots, as new areas north of the river. The writing of the cahiers led to high expectations for the changes of the Estates General, and on 1789 of April, riots about an industrial dispute outside of the wallpaper manufacturer Revillon took place. Lots of people in Paris were literate by this time, and it meant that large numbers of people could be influenced and informed through the means of pamphlets and newspapers. Crowds were also moved by orators who demanded change and spoke out against privilege. The first major political riots were over the dismissal of Necker on the 11th of July, which developed into the storming of the Bastille, and the sans-culottes took part in many of these events and were wealthier than the poorest in Paris, being crafts and tradesmen. The creation of the National Assembly and eventually the National Constituent Assembly gave people a place through which reforms could be carried out. In the clubs, political action became more involved in the upper class. The sans-culottes were represented in the Commune and the National Guard. The Champs de Mars massacre and the flight to Varennes meant that people sought an end to the constitutional monarchy. Talking about the Jacobins Club once again, they were mostly middle-class members, They were divided about the war against Austria in 1792, and under Robespierre, they dominated the French politics and government and implemented radical new policies. Let's talk about the overthrow of the monarchy, which took place in 1792. Firstly, the origins and impact of war. Austria and Prussia issued the Pulnitz Declaration, which threatened military intervention in support of Louis XVI on August 1791. Revolutionaries also had to be wary about the émigré troops on the northeast frontier of France. All of this resulted in a declaration of war placed on Austria, against Austria. Following this, the kings had his clashes with the assembly. The Girondins were appointed to government and were made in control of the debates in the Legislative Assembly. Girondins were those in favour of war to make the revolutionary more radical, originally led by Brissot. They passed two laws not making the clerical oath a crime, and property of the émigrés to be confiscated. And Louis vetoed both of these. Didn't really have a choice. The sans-culottes in the constitution. Sans-Culottes in Paris and the Paris Commune wanted more radical approaches to food price rises and food shortages through state intervention. Overthrow of the monarchy, 1792. On the 20th of June, thousands of sans-culottes occupied the Tuileries Palace and forced Louis to wear the red cap of liberty. In July, following the decree of a national state of emergency, the National Guard, aka the Fédérés, arrived in Paris. Prussia's army commander threatened to destroy Paris in the Brunswick Manifesto if the king were to be harmed, which linked Louis with the enemy, which was bad for him. On the 10th of August, the Tuileries Palace was attacked once again, and Louis hid with the Legislative Assembly and the deputies, who later gave him up quite quickly. Louis and Marie Antoinette were both executed in 1793. Let's talk about the September massacres. The revolutionary continue. I don't know. The revolutionary wars continued to fail, and as the same time of the establishment of the Provisional Executive Council, Lafayette defected to the Austrians, and 1,300 prisoners were murdered after rumours that they would break out and help fight alongside the Austrians. Alright, now we can talk about the Convention of the Terror following all of this. In 1793, most of Europe was against France, which is why they set up these different things. The Committee of Public Safety, which was 12 men that coordinated the war effort, and was originally a war cabinet dominated by Danton. Carnot was behind the levy en masse, which they put in place, and it oversaw the execution of 83 generals between 93 and 94. And the second thing that was set up was the Committee of General Security, which was 12 deputies who oversee state security, including police. They prosecute foreign agents and counterfeiters of the assignats, and they report regularly to the National Convention. Let's talk about the coming of the terror. The National Convention grain prices led to a massive grain black market. The émigrés in Paris called for higher taxes on the rich and death to hoarders. They surrounded the National Convention and demanded a sans-culotte revolutionary army, which is what they got. And anger rose as Marat and Lepeletier were assassinated. Talking about political terror, on September the 17th, 1793, the National Convention passed the Law of Suspects, which expanded the definition of who was against the revolution, which included anyone without a legitimate a certificate of loyalty from their local watch committee, which was called a Cirisme, Crisme. In terms of executions, in 1794, the national total reached 16,594 death sentences, and 8% of these were nobles, 6% were the clergy, and 40% were the bourgeoisie, so the majority of 72% were workers and poor. 8,700 were executed in the Vendée region, which resulted in more scorched earth attacks and guerrilla attacks. And 200 100,000 people were dead by the end of the revolt. In December, the Revolutionary Commission saw prisoners killed by cannon fire, aka grape shot. In terms of the religious terror, de-Christianization spread during 1794, pushed by the revolutionary armies and the sans-culottes. Joseph Fouché played a key role in the terror and in the CPS, following the dismissal of Carlot de Herbois in November. Robespierre disliked these attackers and wanted the attackers on the revolution and wanted to establish a revolutionary religion. Right, let's talk about the rise of Robespierre. He was first elected to the Estates General in 1789. He rose to prominence in the Jacobin Club. On the 5th of September 1792, he was elected to the National Convention and became the leader of the Montagnard faction. There was a struggle of power between the Montagnard faction and the Girondins, which came to a head in the journey of the 2nd of June 1793, where the National Convention was surrounded by National Guards, and 21 Girondins were arrested and executed by the National Guard. Let's talk about the dictatorship of the CPS under Robespierre. Let's talk about the law of Frimaire, which was in place on the 4th of December 1793. The CGS and the CPS had following this, had full executive powers, and the sans-culottes power was limited by the restrictions of Paris Commune meetings, so they weren't allowed to meet as frequently. Law of Frimaire disbanded all revolutionary armies except those in Paris. Indulgence campaigned for less terror with Danton, and under the law of Frimaire these people were executed in April. And also the Herbatists, who campaigned for more terror, were executed a couple, just a bit before the indulgence were. Let's talk about the Great Terror. During this period, the law of general police was put in place, which allowed the CPS to set up a police bureau that would catch counter-revolutionaries. The law of 19 Floreal gave the Paris Revolutionary Tribunal jurisdiction over the counter-revolutionary offences. The law of Prairial on the 10th of June 1794, once again, like the law of Floreal, widened the definition of political crimes so that nearly anyone could be included. From this point onwards, defence witnesses didn't need to be heard, and there was no need for evidence to prosecute. In terms of religion, during this period of the rise of Robespierre created the cult of the Supreme Being in May 1794. Let's talk about the fall of Robespierre and the Thermidorian reaction. So what was Thermidor? It was a coup following the extremism of Robespierre and the committees. It happened when Robespierre suggested that there was a conspiracy against public liberty, and he was shouted down in the National Convention, as they believed that he was accusing them to their faces, and he refused to give their names. Robespierre and Couthon and Saint-Just, aka Saint Just, all CPS members, were arrested, escaped, and then arrested again and executed. Robespierre fell because he had been ill and had withdrawn from the CPS and the National Convention. He had quarrels with Fouché and the supporters of de-Christianization. He lost sans-culotte support after the attacks on Herbatists. Now, what was the Thermidorian reaction? This was like the things that happened following the Thermidorian, following Thermidor. So these changes were made. CPS and CGS membership changed frequently. The establishment of new committees to share government responsibilities. There was the reorganisation of the Revolutionary Tribunal. There was the closure of the Jacobin Club. Yet Jacobin members still were in the councils. there was the repealing of the law of Prior, and all suspects were released from prison at the time, like political suspects anyway. Talking about the White Terror, in Paris, gangs attacked former Jacobins, sans-culottes and militants, and about 2,000 had been killed by 1795. Guerrilla warfare flared up in the Vendée with the Charron movement, and in 1793, Parisian risings following harsh winter and food shortages took place. Germinal, 1st of April 1795, there were huge demonstrations following food shortages. The National Guard stayed loyal to the convention and had the demonstrators dispersed. Yet many demonstrators were given the dry guillotine, which was exile to Guinea. And then on Prior, the 22nd and 20th of May 1795, a more serious journey took place where the National Guard joined demonstrators, which resulted in executions and arrests. This led to the sans-culottes being disbanded and broken finally. And let's talk about the establishment of the Directory following the Thermidorian reaction. The Constitution from 1795 by the Thermidorians. It was designed to prevent monarchy or dictatorship, but clearly that didn't go very well. And France was to be ruled by 5 people in the Directory, who were chosen by the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. Council of 500, you had to be over 30, and you initiated legislation, so basically commons, whereas the Ancients was 250 members, over 40 who approved legislation, so basically the House of Lords. Weaknesses of this new constitution were that yearly elections led to instability. There were no mechanisms to resolve disputes between the two councils and the directors, which eventually led to stalemates and inaction on specific laws. In terms of economic problems, the Directory tried to solve inflation by creating a new currency, which failed, and metal coins became the new currency. Despite this, not enough coins were in circulation, and this hindered trade and commerce, which created deflation, which was just bad. In terms of financial problems, 2/3 of the national debt was written off through special bonds to government creditors, which led to the bankruptcy of the 2/3 later on, when these bonds dipped massively in value. Much more tax was put in place by the finance minister, which was good, but served to alienate certain groups. And that is the revolution from October 1789 to the Directory 1795. Alright, now I'm moving on to Napoleon Bonaparte to 1807. Let's do this. Napoleon's background, character, and military leadership. He was born in 1769 in Corsica into a minor aristocratic family. He went to military school and later became a lieutenant of artillery. In 1793, his family had to flee Corsica due to his involvement with revolutionaries. He was a Jacobin supporter and made friends with Robespierre's brother, Augustin. What was his first fame? He proved himself in a leading role to expel British forces and recapture Toulon in 1793. He was then put in charge of the coastal defences on the Mediterranean. On the 13th of Vendémiaire, in October 1795, The convention was under threat from royalist mobs in Paris, and Napoleon was put in charge of suppressing the crowds. He won with, quote-unquote, a whiff of grape shot, and was made the commander of the French army in northern Italy. In terms of marriage, he originally married Josephine in 1796, after her husband was arrested and executed. Napoleon's military leadership. His initial success at Toulon led him to later become the Brigadier General of the French army in Italy. He was also used by the Directory to push back against Parisian mobs. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 97. In this he used rapid advances and surprise attacks to allow him to beat the Italian state of Piedmont in 2 weeks. He then won at the Battle of Rivoli in January 1797, and he inspired the assault on a defended bridge at the Battle of Lodi in May with his orator skills. And when he was close to taking Vienna in France, just before the Austrians sued for peace, which they got, and it led to Bonaparte himself negotiating the Treaty of Campo in the Italian campaign. Campo Formio, which gave France, the Austrian Netherlands, and much of northern Italy. So that was like Amsterdam and that. Including this, France took 50,000 prisoners in total. He was able to achieve all this in the Italian campaign by maintaining high morale, moving quickly and effectively, using artillery as well as concentrated fire, using the doctrine of the central position to flank his enemy's armies. Let's talk about the Egyptian campaign. It was an ambitious plan to undermine Britain by establishing a French presence in the Middle East. Initially, they won the Battle of the Pyramids with artillery fairly easily, with very, very few losses. But on the 1st of August, Britain destroyed Napoleon's fleet in Alexandria at the Battle of the Nile. That was Nelson. Despite this, France still won the Battle of the Nile, but was stranded. They then kind of ventured into Gaza and took Jaffa and Haifa because they needed kind of a place to stay. But Jaffa was a bloodbath of 1,400 people. And following this kind of mixed victory, Napoleon left his army, which was suffering from disease. Despite this, his reputation continued to grow due to publications back in France. Let's talk about the weakness of the Directory and the coup of Brumaire. The decline in popularity and power of the Directory. Firstly, there was Jourdan's Law in 1798, which reintroduced conscription. Then there was the Second Coalition, where a new coalition made it much harder to continue France's revenue income stream from plunder alone, which made the Directory much more unpopular. The coup of Prairial in 1799 saw neo-Jacobins forcefully forcing the removal of two directors and passing two new laws, the first of which being a forced loan on the rich. Then we have the coup of Brumaire in 1799, in which Abbé Sieyès chooses Napoleon as his revolutionary general, not his first choice. So Sieyès moved the councils out of Paris to Saint-Cloud on the pretext of a neo-Jacobin plot. When Napoleon was addressing the council of the 500, he was shouted down until his brother arrived with reinforcements. The plotters then removed the councils and issued a decree abolishing the Directory. It was then established that there would be 3 new councils, and this is the new constitution. Firstly, there was the notables, split between the tribunate and the legislature. The tribunate changed every 3 years. There were 100 members older than 25, and they discussed legislation, but they couldn't vote on it, whereas the legislature voted on legislation but couldn't discuss it. They changed every 5 years, and they were 300 over the age of 30. Then there was the executive, which was split between the first council, which appointed ministers and approved legislation, and was elected for 10 years. The Senate, which was nominated by the first council and was appointed for life, and revised legislature. And the Council of the State, which was 30 to 40 members chosen by the first council and nominated all central and local officials. Then we have Napoleon's reforms as first consul. In political changes, with Napoleon's consolidation of power, he established prefects as the heads of the 83 departments, who were elected by the first council, who chose the mayors. Then there was the Council for Life situation. In December 1800, there was an assassination plot on Napoleon, which was stopped, which he used as a preface to deport 100 neo-Jacobins, which made the Senate offer him the position of Council for Life. A plebiscite referendum was held, and he won this 3,500,000 votes to 8,000 votes, so it's clearly a fraud, your low vote. And the Senate was I don't know, man. That was my stomach. The Senate was entrenched, and the tribunate was praised for opposing was purged for opposing the Civil Code of 1802. Let's talk about the Civil Code of 1802. There's arguments that it's liberal and illiberal. The liberal arguments, and parts of it, is that it introduced laws for all citizens. Judges guided laws, but were able to propose laws based on their knowledge of the law. Those who bought church land wouldn't be contested in their ownership. The partage system of inheritance was introduced. The abolition of feudalism was confirmed, and the privileges of the Catholic Church were removed. Whereas on the illiberal side, there was the reintroduction of slavery in the colonies. Unfaithful wives and disobedient children could be imprisoned, and husbands had custody of the children. And that was the illiberal and liberal factors of the Civil Code. Now let's move on to a couple more reforms that Napoleon had as council, and then so reforms in education. Napoleon believed that the job of education was to supply France with officers in the military. They would be recruited from the sons of the notables, which was the property owning class. There were 45 lacries, which were elite schools established in 1802. There were 300 secondary schools established shortly after 1805. There were all standardized lessons and textbooks used in the education system, and the system was controlled by the Imperial University from 1808. On top of that, the schools that were run by the church were more philosophical and were allowed after the Concordat. What was the position of the church in society following the Concordat and its aftermath? Negotiations in 1800 began, and then the Concordat between the Pope and Napoleon was signed in 1801. This meant that the Catholic Church recognised the revolution and agreed not to try to regain any lost lands. The church was to be state-controlled, with its clergy appointed and paid by the government, to which they had to swear loyalty. Toleration of other faiths, including Jews, was put in place and allowed. Organic articles gave Napoleon more control over bishops. Talking about financial reforms, there was a new direct land tax. The Bank of France was implemented, which had the sole right to issue paper money, which made it easier to raise funds centrally and unitarily. In terms of the currency, the franc de Germinal was based on silver and gold coins, which ensured a stable base for the French economy, something that the assignat had failed to do. Let's talk about Napoleon's military successes and failures after 1799. The army and conquest during the Consulate and the Empire. Napoleon needed military success to maintain his position. Defeating the Austrians at Marengo in June 1800 was largely due to Dessaix, that's D-E-S-A-I-X, which built up the destruction of the Second Coalition. Regardless, it was still seen as Napoleon's victory. Napoleon failed to recapture Saint Dominique and had sold Louisiana to the US during this period. In the War of the Third Coalition of 1805 to 1806, the Russian Tsar was angry about the shooting of Duke de Enghien and French actions in Germany, and Austrians were angered by French expansion in Germany. Napoleon's plans for British invasion were crushed at the Battle of Trafalgar, and in the following months, 3 months from October 1805, he won against the Austrians in Ulan and against the Austrians and Russians at Austerlitz. And we have the War of the Fourth Coalition, which is 1806 to 1807. Prussia was provoked by the continental system and expanding influence into Germany. They were defeated at Jena and Aosta in 1806. The French army then pushed through to Russia and had to suffer 2 harsh victories at Alais and Friedland. From here, Napoleon was able to force both Prussia and Russia to sign the Treaty of Tilsit, which divided Europe between the French and Russian empires. Failures at sea included Trafalgar. The reasons for military success is mainly about Napoleon's leadership, the weakness of his armies, and the strengths of the Grand Army. The establishment and natures of the empire. In 1804, December the 2nd, Napoleon crowned himself emperor following the foiling of the Bourbon plot, which was the one I previously mentioned involving Duke de Enghien, and he then made Josephine the empress. constitutional developments that came from this. The tribunate and legislature fell into irrelevancy. The legislature was later abolished in 1808. The government was conducted through the Senate and the Council of State under Napoleon's control. In terms of class distinction and tithes, he was able to win over his rivals with gifts of land, little gifts, titles and honours. So here are some of them. The Legion of Honour was created in 1802 and received a fashionable medal and annual sum, and there were 38,000 members of this Legion of Honour by 1814, which was mostly soldiers. Between 1804 and 1808, new titles were created for leading officials of the imperial court, such as marshals of France, princes, dukes, barons. If these if the recipients had a large enough income, they could choose to make their titles hereditary. Members of the Senate were also given large country estates and an set annual income, and were appointed as prefects in their own region. And then minor army officers and government officials could be given enough money to buy a house in Paris and live comfortably. The establishment of the emperor status as a title. Napoleon moved into the Tuileries Palace and developed a court-style life, allowing the emigres to return. He depicted himself as an heir to the great medieval emperor Charlemagne. In terms of censorship, 60 Parisian newspapers were closed in 1800 in January, and by 1811 there were only 4 papers, each of them having their own censor. And that is Napoleon's Reformers Council and his background. Alright, and now we're on to the fourth and final chapter of this, the decline and fall of Napoleon between 1807 and 1815. Alrighty. Alright, so the continental system. Following the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar and the blockade of French ports, Napoleon in 1806 announced the continental system in the Berlin Decrees, which was extended in 1807 by the Milan Decrees. This was meant to protect French business from British competition, and was going to force cash payments on British imports that would further deplete the British economy, rendering them unable to continue the war and their diplomatic aid to parts of Europe. The effects that it had on France, negative effects, hurt seaside economies, and the export industry suffered, but Central and Eastern French trade routes along the Rhine and the Alps opened up. Effects on Europe. It created tensions with countries inside and outside of the French Empire, especially Portugal, which led to the Peninsular War and the Russian withdrawal of the continental system, which precipitated Napoleon's invasion in 1812. The effects on Britain. At the beginning, the lack of French naval power sort of tampered the system. Markets in the Americas helped reinforce Britain's trade. However, other historians suggest that in this period trade fell in Britain as low as 50%, and Britain's efforts to counter-blockade France was one of the causes for the Anglo-American War in 1812. The effect that it had on Napoleon's downfall was that it failed to bring about British defeat. It proved that the need to invade Portugal and enforce it through the Peninsular War. It helped push forward the Russian campaign in 1812, as it was partly a product of the Tsar's willingness to cooperate with the system. And this was along with concerns about the human and financial costs with the war and the economic problems in France, which further contributed to Napoleon's unpopularity at home. Let's talk about the role of Britain in bringing about Napoleon's downfall. So we have financial subsidies. £600 million were paid out to allies in Europe, and possibly 450,000 Austrians and Russian troops were being paid for by Britain by 1813. The subsidy bill reached 10 million a year, pounds, by 1814. In terms of British diplomatic efforts, Pitt, the PM at the time, played a major part in organising the Third Coalition when there was a brief truce of 1802 to 1803, and it broke down. British diplomatic efforts helped persuade Austria to oppose Napoleon in 1809, though it was defeated. The efforts kept Austria, Russia and Prussia together in 1812 for the final struggle. In terms of naval power, constant pressure on French trade and imports of war supplies to neutral countries through Britain's naval power was a thing, and the orders in council gave Britain the legal right to stop and search any ship that was heading for a French port and seize its cargo. This led to an attack on Copenhagen in 1807 and USA in 1812, potentially, and then it also led to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. So the orders in council. In terms of British land forces in the Peninsular War, British army was based in the Iberian Peninsula, and it drained French resources and pinned down 300,000 French troops. Britain invaded France in 1814 with Napoleon blaming the Spanish ulcer. In 1814, the Battle of Waterloo took place, and then that resulted in the invasion. The Anglo-Dutch army was able to block Napoleon's invasion of Brussels during the 100 Days, resulting in his imprisonment at St. Helena. And then we have the British war effort. There was an industrial push for the British people. Oh my god, these people on the street, dickheads. Stop banging now. British war effort. The industrial push of the British people ensured Britain's strength as the French opposition. How important was the British war effort? 60,000 British troops didn't match the hundreds of thousands that Napoleon had. Napoleon's intent on continuing wars established British diplomats, enabled British diplomats to rally continental European powers against him. The continental system was a huge reason for the 1812 war with Russia, but not the only reason, as Britain and Russia had close ties. And British naval power prevented an invasion of itself, but it could not on its own defeat Napoleon, and it didn't. Let's talk about the campaigns in Spain and Russia. The Peninsular War of 1808 to 1814. Napoleon starts by replacing the King of Spain with his brother Joseph Bonaparte, and the Spanish rose in a revolt in Madrid that was brutally suppressed. This resulted in guerrilla warfare. A small French army was defeated by regular troops, and news of this spread across Europe, and people were getting optimistic. Following this, Napoleon took his Grand Army to Spain in response. He couldn't complete pacification because he needed to go and fight Austria. And while this was happening, British troops and aid on the Portuguese border in 1808 helped with reinforcing. After a French attack in 1810 to 1811, Lord Wellesley, was able to counterattack and push Napoleon all the way back to the Pyrenees in retreat, one of France's natural borders. This war was not hugely decisive, but it drained French resources. Now let's talk about the Russian campaign. In 1812, why? Napoleon's remarriage to the Austrian Marie-Louise after Josephine, and Russia and Austria were rivals. The rival ambition to seize Turkish territories and the Balkans. Rival ambitions in the Baltic, not the Balkans, both. The disagreement of the future of the Grand Duchy of Poland. Disagreements over the continental system. In it, Napoleon had 600,000 men invade Russia in 1812. Following the occupation of Moscow, the Tsar refused to negotiate a peace treaty, and Napoleon was forced to retreat. Reasons why it was a bad failure. Everything except the Battle of Borodino had proved the Russians' ability to not waste their resources on fighting Napoleon. The Russians adopted a scorched earth strategy. The Russian Cossacks constantly attacked the French staying troops. Napoleon lacked a clear strategic objective. His approach of controlling every detail could not work over such a large army across such a large country, and thousands of his men died by disease following poor medical supply. He stayed in Moscow for a month, which was too long, and because of this, the Grand Army had been reduced from 600,000 to about 120,000 men. Let's talk about the campaigns of 1813 to 1814 and Napoleon's abdication. The War of the Sixth Coalition between 1813 and 14. He had all the. They all had the common aim of the liberation of Germany. It included all four major European powers. Its members had reformed their aims and tactics. France was in decline. The coalition's patrons and leaders adopted a unified strategy. Despite this, Napoleon was determined to beat Russia with his remaining 400,000 men. Despite this, the Allies had 800,000 men in total. Talking about the battles, the Allies lost at Dresden, but they won at Leipzig. The Battle of the Nations saw Napoleon attack with a good defensive strategy all the way back to France, and he defeated He defeated something on the way back. I think it might have been... he defeated different groups on the way back. I think it's Bavaria on the way back. The Allies offered a peace proposal in 1813, which he rejected, and a second proposal, which was also rejected, led to an invasion of France. Napoleon was no longer had the support for a defensive war, and by March 1884 Paris was occupied. Napoleon abdicated, and the Bourbon monarchy, monarchy was restored. The Peace of Paris, 30th of May 1814. In this period, France lost all its territorial gains from 1792. Napoleon was exiled to Elba with a pension. Four major superpowers began to fall out of the French area, and Britain and Austria made a secret alliance against Prussia and Russia at the time. Then we have Napoleon's rule after 1807. This is just going back a little bit. So in the Napoleonic Empire, by 1807, France dominated Europe with its natural frontiers, annexed territories and satellite states. In terms of the value of the Napoleonic Empire, annexed territories were treated as part of France, provided a consistent stream of revenue from taxes. Satellite states were treated differently, but were expected to pay tribute and provide soldiers for the Grand Army. Napoleon's family ruled on the thrones of these states, and satellite states provided for roughly half of Napoleon's military expeditions between 1804 and 1814. Problems with this was that conscription was hated and resisted, especially in Naples, Austria, and Spain, where there were revolts. Napoleon's family members were neither competent or loyal. For example, Louis Bonaparte refused the continental system in Holland, and Joseph was replaced by Marshal Marat, who later turned to Spain against Napoleon. In terms of control in the empire, under admin, satellite states fell under similar department and prefect systems as France had. The amalgamation of smaller provinces into nations included Germany and Italy. The gendarmerie were units of 6 to 7 military soldiers stationed in rural centres and towns to provide protection and law and order. In terms of financial and economic policies of Napoleon's rule after 1807, the reformed tax system of France became a model for the rest of Europe and its satellite states. Italy and Holland were being heavily taxed, which damaged their local economies. In terms of social policies, Napoleon didn't abolish feudalism in all its territories, and he exercised his power and exerted its power through the existing elites of the satellite states. The nobles and the elites hardly changed in Italy, Germany or Poland during this period. And we have the 100 Days in 1815. Napoleon decided to return from Elba when he saw that the Allies were disagreeing about the peace terms that King Louis the XVIII was becoming unpopular. I think previously I might have called the other king the 16th. I don't know, man. It's XVII and then XVIII. The 1st of March 1815, he landed near Cannes with 1,000 men He landed near Cannes with 1,000 men and rapidly went north. He urged his old troops to join him and save France from the priests, quote, and nobles, quote. Marshal Ney and his troops joined Napoleon, and this progressed. This little coalition progressed to Paris, and Louis decided to flee. By the 20th of March, he was back in the palace. He proposed a more liberal Acte Additionnel for the constitution, although privately doubting it. He sent a message to the monarchs of Europe saying that he wanted peace and he would accept the Treaty of Paris. Despite this, there was restarting the wars. The Allies returned to 1814, returned their 1814 Treaty of Chaumont and tried to raise forces, which Napoleon had 140,000 already. Napoleon advanced against the Netherlands, hoping to discourage the Allies from further action. He had initial success against the Prussians, but failed to achieve a crushing defeat. He then halved his troops to pursue them before they could rally to pursue the Prussians before they could rally with the Brits, and then an initial encounter with Wellington was too indecisive, and Wellington left to reinforce Brussels' defences at Waterloo. On the 18th of June, the last Napoleonic war took place, which was Waterloo, which involved the Brits and the Prussians. Napoleon's abdication and the second, in which he just got crushed. Napoleon's abdication and the Second Treaty of Paris. Napoleon lacked support to continue the war and abdicated on June 22nd, 1815, and was taken to St. Helena. And then the Vienna settlement was put in place. And the key aim was to surround a weak France with strong neighbours to prevent French expansion. Belgium was united with Holland. South Spain was returned to its Bourbon rulers. Switzerland's independence was guaranteed, and the empire was dissolved. So, what were Napoleon's personal failings and the reasons for his fall? Well, firstly we have war weariness in France. By 1814, France was not going to rally anymore. They now had a desire for peace. The death of 900,000 young men was a great loss. Secondly, in terms of military reasons, the enemies of Napoleon had changed their tactics to combat his. His armies were less composed of Frenchmen. It was more like a European army. For example, 2/3 of French army conscripts weren't actually French. The battles were not inspired because these battles weren't inspired by loyalty or nationalism. There were 3 changes among his enemies. By 1814, they were more united in their coalition and more determined. The attempted invasion of England resulted in a steadfast economic stream of resources to Napoleon's continental enemies. In terms of nationalism, the invasions of Spain and Prussia had unleashed nationalist pride, which made for heavy resistance. This can be seen in the Spanish ulcer of the continuous Spanish guerrilla battles, and at the Battle of Borodino in terms of Russia, etc. 5. His personal failings. He had a failure to accept reality. He ignored warnings against invading Spain. He did not have a set plan established for the invasion of Russia. He didn't accept peace terms in 1813. He lost confidence the confidence of his most senior advisors, Fouché and Talleyrand. His devotion to his family led to incompetency in the ruling of other states, and they didn't have the ability for the responsibility that they had faced. His personal health was failing, and by Waterloo his tactics were tired and unimaginative. That is the French stuff.